It is the 3rd of July 1994. Tens of thousands of people have gathered in the streets of Gaza City. They are there to welcome the leader of the Palestinian movement in exile back to the Gaza Strip after decades living in Kuwait, Jordan, Lebanon, and Tunisia. 2 days earlier, he crossed from Egypt into the Strip, and he is now arriving in Gaza City. A year earlier, the Oslo Accord was signed in Washington, D.C. The two-state solution is now in motion. But in little more than a decade, the peace process will be largely in ruins as Hamas claims power in Gaza and the Palestinian Liberation Organization descends into corruption and inaction. On the 3rd of July 1994, though, with the exiled leader entering Gaza City, it seems that the dream of a Palestinian state may be possible once more. The man's name? Yasser Arafat, leader of Palestine. The man known to history as Yasser Arafat is understood to have been born in August 1929 in Cairo, the capital of Egypt. The exact date is uncertain. Most historians conclude that he was born on the 4th of August, but other documents state the 24th. Owing to poor record-keeping in parts of the Middle East at the time, it is possible that he was even born in 1928, though the 4th of August 1929 is the most probable date. His full name was Mohammed Abdul Rauf Arafat al-Qudwa al-Husseini. It seems reasonably clear that he was born in Cairo, though Arafat later muddied the waters when it came to this, as he tried to claim he was born in either Gaza or Jerusalem at various stages in an effort to cement the perception that he was Palestinian by both blood and birth. Yasser was a name he would acquire in the 1950s. Arafat was able to make this claim about his place of birth because his parents were broadly Palestinian. His father was Abdel Rauf al-Qudwa al-Husseini. He came from Gaza City, but his mother was Egyptian, meaning that Arafat had both Palestinian and Egyptian heritage. Abdel was a grocery, spice and incense merchant and claimed descent from the al-Husseini tribe that had long-standing connections to Jerusalem under Arab rule. Arafat's mother was Zahwa Abul Saud, whose family also came from Jerusalem. He was the 6th child from his parents' marriage. Young Arafat would never really know his mother, though, as she died of a serious kidney condition in 1933 when he was only 4 years old. Overall, because of his parents' heritage, Arafat could be said to have been 3/4 Palestinian and 1/4 Egyptian, while he would also spend large parts of his youth and young adult years in Egypt. His heritage was mixed, though for large parts of history, people in the Middle East have tended to view themselves more in terms of their Arab identity and their tribal and clan affiliations than strictly as citizens of specific nation-states. Arafat was born in a period of colonial rule in much of the Middle East. For instance, while Egypt acquired a nominal independence in 1922, it had effectively been taken over by the British in 1882 and would remain a protectorate in many ways until the early 1950s, with Britain stationing large armed forces in the country and controlling the Suez Canal. Similarly, after the Ottoman Empire was defeated at the end of the First World War, the British and French had taken over their extensive territories in the Levant. The British established a protectorate over the Emirate of Transjordan and governed what we now call Israel and Palestine as Mandatory Palestine. To the north, the French ruled Syria and the Lebanon as a separate mandate. Mandatory Palestine was a difficult place for the British to rule. The Zionist movement had begun back in the 1880s, as Jewish people from Europe began settling in the region under Ottoman rule, with the theoretical goal of establishing a new Zion, a Jewish state in their ancestral homeland. As anti-Semitism escalated dramatically in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants arrived. Intercommunal tensions between Palestinian Muslims and the Jewish community escalated as a result, as each vied for control of as much territory as possible when British rule over the Mandate would eventually come to an end. This was the context in which Arafat grew up. Arafat's childhood was complex and had a good bit of mythology around it. It seems clear that after his mother died, his father sent the children away to be raised by their extended family in Jerusalem. Hence, Yasser was able to claim in later life that he was not only three-quarters Palestinian, but that he had also spent much of his youth growing up in Jerusalem, during a formative period of Arab-Israeli relations in the mandated territory. The question of how long he spent here is another matter. Arafat was anxious to suggest he spent years there, though the evidence is less conclusive and he does appear to have moved between Jerusalem and Cairo. What is clear is that he would have been exposed to the debates on the tensions between Palestinians and Jewish people in the British Mandate in his youth, whether in Mandatory Palestine or in Egypt. He was back in Cairo by the late 1930s and was there throughout the era of the Second World War. In the Egyptian capital, he was broadly raised by his older sister. His relationship with his father was not good, and years later, when he died, Yasser did not attend his funeral. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Arafat was studying at the University of King Fahd I, the name at the time for Cairo University, where he studied engineering. More broadly, he read extensively about the Palestinian question and the major texts of Zionism by Theodor Herzl and others. There was no way for anyone in this part of the world to avoid the contentious issue of Mandatory Palestine at the time. In the aftermath of the war, the Jewish residents of the Mandate had begun demanding an independent Jewish state. Their arguments were buoyed by sympathy for their cause because of the Holocaust that had been perpetrated by Nazi Germany in Europe during the war, while there had also been a huge further influx of Jewish settlers into the Levant in the years following the end of the war. Still, other actions, such as the terrorist campaign engaged in by the Irgun, or National Military Organization for the Land of Israel, garnered less sympathy. On the 22nd of July 1946, for instance, they bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, the center of the British administration in the mandated territory, killing 91 people and injuring dozens more. It was clear, as 1946 and 1947 went on, that certain elements within the Zionist movement in Mandatory Palestine were determined to acquire as large a slice of the entire mandate to form an Israeli state as possible, while many Palestinians and Arab Muslims further afield were also adamant that there should be no Jewish state in the Middle East. The scene was set for a clash between the two groups. In Cairo, in response to these developments, Arafat began drifting further towards Arab nationalism and the cause of an independent Palestine that would control as much of the British Mandate as possible. By 1946, even though he was only around 17 years of age, he was involved in smuggling weapons into the Mandate from Egypt for use by the Arab Higher Committee that was preparing for war with the Jewish community in the Mandate. The weapons which Arafat and other Egypt-based Palestinian nationalists were smuggling into Mandatory Palestine in 1946 and 1947 were soon in use. By 1947, there was effectively a low-level war underway in the Mandate between parts of the Jewish community and Palestinian groups like the Arab High Committee and the Army of the Holy War. At the same time, the newly formed United Nations was attempting to adjudicate on the issue of mandatory Palestine. In September 1947, that body drew up a partition plan for the mandate, which was adopted as UN policy in November 1947. Under the terms of it, there would be two nations created out of the mandate: Israel and Palestine. It was intended that these would broadly follow the modern borders of Israel and the intended Palestinian state, but Palestine was to be granted greater territory under the 1947 agreement. In addition to the West Bank and Gaza Strip, Palestine was to have a tranche of territory in the north around Acre and Nazareth, while the Gaza Strip would have extended inland into the Negev desert. The West Bank would also have been greater in size. Effectively, the mandate would have been divided in half, while Jerusalem would have been administered by the UN as an international city. While the plan was accepted by moderate Zionists, the Arab High Committee made what, in retrospect, seems like a catastrophic error and rejected the UN plan. As a result, in May 1948, the First Arab-Israeli War broke out as Israel unilaterally moved to establish itself without reaching an agreement with the Palestinian leadership, a measure which involved hundreds of thousands of Palestinians being displaced. The nascent Israeli state faced a pan-Arab alliance of Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia, but it ultimately managed to emerge victorious, though with the Jordanians occupying much of the West Bank and Egypt securing control over the Gaza Strip. Arafat fought in the war, taking part in the fighting around Gaza, but he was a very young man and did not play any kind of senior commanding role. After the war ended early in 1949, he returned to Cairo to recommence his studies. Life in Egypt in the 1950s for Arafat involved a lot of change. His father died in 1952. By then, Yasser was back at Cairo University and would eventually complete his studies in engineering. He served as president of the General Union of Palestinian Students. It was around this time that he adopted the name Yasser, a word which translates to something akin to facilitator, a word which would express a desire to be seen as a political mediator. The name expressed both his move into politics and his break with his past following his father's death. The wider country was changing too. King Farouk and the British-backed government were overthrown by a coup led by the military officers Mohammed Naguib and Gamal Abdel Nasser on the 23rd of July 1952. Nasser emerged as the military dictator of Egypt and a keen advocate of pan-Arab unity in the course of the 1950s. That same pan-Arabism stressed the common religion, culture, and identity of the Arab people in the Middle East and looked forward to a day when countries like Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and the states of the Arabian Peninsula might be united into a major Middle Eastern power. Unsurprisingly, the Palestinian cause was important to Nasser as a result, something which heartened many advocates of the Palestinian cause in Egypt like Arafat. Arafat was still living in Egypt and would witness a high point of the Egyptian and pan-Arab movement, which Nasser hoped to promote. While the Egyptian Revolution of 1952 had largely seen Egypt become fully independent, the British and French had retained control over the Suez Canal zone, and Nasser and the military commanders did not move at that time to remove them from the northeast of the country. That changed in the summer of 1956, when he nationalized the canal in response to the withdrawal of Western funding for the Aswan Dam project on the River Nile, an energy and infrastructure project that he hoped would transform the Egyptian economy. After months of escalating tensions, Israel invaded Egypt on the 29th of October 1956, with the goal of opening up the Straits of Tiran, leading from the Gulf of Aqaba to the Red Sea, and thus the main maritime routeway for Israel into the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. The Egyptians had been blockading Israeli traffic through the region since 1948. They also hoped to secure lands from Egypt that they had failed to acquire full control over in 1948. The British and French initially called for a diplomatic solution, but then they joined the Israelis in the military action against the Egyptians. What changed the situation dramatically was that US President Dwight Eisenhower effectively sided with Egypt and the Soviet Union and called out the British, French, and Israelis for infringing on the sovereignty of Egypt. Thus, the brief Second Arab-Israeli War, or Suez Crisis as it is more commonly known, ended in humiliation for Britain in particular, and proved that US support for Israel in the Middle East at that time was not limitless. Arafat later claimed that he volunteered to join the Egyptian military at this time, but had his request declined, though there is no evidence to indicate that he did so. A few months after the end of the Suez Crisis, Arafat decided to leave Egypt. He headed to Kuwait, a small state on the Persian Gulf which was drawing large numbers of diaspora Palestinians to it at the time, men and women who had been displaced in 1948 at the time of the commencement of the First Arab-Israeli War. Kuwait had struck oil in 1938 and had begun to exploit it in the aftermath of the Second World War. By the 1950s, the economy was booming there. With his engineering degree, Arafat decided to leave Egypt, a country which was struggling economically, even as Nasser tried to promote his Arab socialist movement, and headed to Kuwait. There he was involved in 1959 in the establishment of Fatah, a militant Palestinian national movement amongst the Palestinian diaspora community in the small Gulf state. Fatah means conquest or liberation, while also being an acronym of sorts for the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. It was while living here and around the time that Fatah was founded that Arafat took to habitually wearing a keffiyeh, or headscarf with a black and white checkered design. This would become his trademark look for the rest of his life. There are few images of Arafat available in which he does not appear in this carefully cultivated way. Beneath the scarf, after a certain time in his life, he was completely bald, something which few people who lived to see him on television or saw his photograph in newspapers over a period of decades would ever be aware of. Such was the ever-present nature of the keffiyeh. Fatah was not the only movement which was founded in the Gulf region in the years following Arafat's arrival there. Several other groups were being established. Eventually, it became apparent that these would benefit from pooling their collective resources, and so in 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, better known as the PLO, was founded at a meeting of Arab leaders in Cairo. Arafat was not present at this, and the PLO would only gradually be brought more closely under Palestinian militant control in the period that followed. By the time the PLO was founded in 1964, Arafat had been moving around the Middle East for some time, building up support for Fatah in a range of different countries and acquiring aid and weapons. Soon, Fatah would begin to cooperate and integrate into the PLO, and over time it became the dominant entity within it. This occurred as Fatah began its military operations in the mid-1960s, launching small military raids across the border of countries like Jordan and Egypt into Israel. These were limited in scale, but they constituted some of the first efforts by Palestinian militants, or fedayeen, to launch guerrilla-style attacks against the Israeli government, independent of the armies of other Arab nations like Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. Effectively, from 1965 onwards, Fatah began to take the struggle for Palestinian independence into its own hands, without relying on the governments of Arab nations. The Palestinian cause suffered a major setback in the summer of 1967. Tensions had been growing between Israel and its neighbors again throughout the decade, fueled by efforts by Egypt to create a pan-Arab state, a project that was briefly furthered when a short-lived union between Egypt and Syria came into effect in 1958. The major source of clashes between Egypt and Israel again focused on Israeli access to the wider Red Sea. This and other issues led to Israel launching a series of attacks on Egyptian targets on the 5th of June 1967. The resulting war would last for just 6 days. Syria, Jordan, and Iraq joined the Egyptians, though they could not prevent the Israelis from winning a major victory in which they seized the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from the Egyptians, the West Bank from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. In response to the 6-day war, the War of Attrition was launched by Arafat and the PLO, in association with Egypt in particular. Through this, attacks were intermittently launched against Israel from Egypt and Jordan. The latter country was now the primary base of operations for Arafat, Fatah, and the PLO. A de facto state of war existed between the PLO here and Israel to the west throughout these years. This included significant military engagements, such as the Battle of Karameh on the 21st of March 1968, during which an Israeli army clashed with the PLO and the Jordanians around the Jordanian border town of Karameh. It failed in one of its primary objectives, to capture or kill Arafat. Arafat was a target of the Israelis in the incursion to Karameh in March 1968 because, by then, he was quite clearly emerging as the main leader of the PLO. Although he had been a senior figure in the formation of both Fatah and the PLO, he was not in charge from the beginning. Instead, Ahmed al-Shukairi was the inaugural chairman of the PLO between 1964 and 1967. He was pushed out of the position in the aftermath of the Six-Day War as a series of highly inflammatory statements which he had made in the mid-1960s were identified as having provided political ammunition to the Israeli government to pursue its aggressive war in the summer of 1967. As he was removed from power, Arafat and his allies replaced him, though his official accession as chairman of the PLO did not take place until 1969. By then, the Palestinian movement was firmly entrenched within Jordan. This was creating a problem for the Hashemite monarchy of the country. Quite simply, there were more Palestinians than Jordanians living in Jordan, and they were highly militant. Determined to prevent his kingdom from becoming a proxy for the planned Palestinian state, King Hussein of Jordan moved in September 1970 to begin forcing Arafat and his followers out of his country. The impetus for doing so was especially strong after the loss of the West Bank in the Six-Day War. The Jordanian Civil War, or Black September as it is also known, commenced with the Jordanian army surrounding PLO Fedayeen camps in Jordan and in the capital Amman. Syria became involved as well, and the conflict threatened to completely destabilize Jordan. Eventually, though, Arafat agreed that the PLO would move its base of operations out of Jordan. They now began relocating to the Lebanon, a country which had been ruled along with Syria as part of the French Mandatory Territory in the Levant after the First World War, and which had the most mixed religious and ethnic population in the region. Lebanon's religious and ethnic diversity was admired by many, and the country was a cosmopolitan one with a strong economic performance in the 20th century. Beirut was known as the Paris of the Middle East on account of its architecture and thriving culture. The arrival of Arafat and the PLO, in combination with other issues that the country was facing, reversed the positive story of modern Lebanese history in the 1970s. Ethno-religious tensions escalated, and the PLO effectively took over large parts of the country as an army within the state, much as they had tried to do in Jordan prior to Black September. All of this eventually led to the outbreak of the Lebanese Civil War in 1975. The conflict would last for 15 years, down to 1990. It has had residual implications down to the present day, and Lebanon has never fully recovered, exhibiting significant elements of a failed state since, with militia groups like Hezbollah controlling parts of the country and the economy crippled. Arafat and the PLO were not solely responsible for this. The conflict was multifaceted. For instance, in the south of the country, the South Lebanon Army emerged in the early stages of the Civil War as an entity attempting to set up a breakaway state for the Christian community within Lebanon. Israel also was involved in the war throughout, at first indirectly and then directly from 1982 onwards. Various powers within the Middle East, such as Syria and Iran, after the revolution there in 1979, were further belligerents, while there were Shia and Sunni factions amongst the Lebanese themselves. In essence, the Lebanese Civil War was a very complex conflict, but there is no doubting that one of the primary causes of the outbreak of it was the arrival of Arafat, Fatah, and the PLO to the country, in large numbers, after being ejected from Jordan at the start of the 1970s. By the time the Lebanese Civil War broke out in 1975, Arafat's profile on the world stage had been bolstered very considerably. On the 13th of November 1974, he addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations, an event which infuriated the government of Israel, but which was undoubtedly of significance in terms of Arafat's emergence as the man who Israel would have to negotiate with if it ever wanted to try and resolve the Palestinian issue in a bilateral manner. The speech was inflammatory for many. Arafat referred to the invasion of Palestine, commencing back at the start of the 1880s as the Zionist movement began, and repeatedly tried to characterize the conflict in the Levant as being a war between a colonized people and a Western imperial power, something which mischaracterized the fact that a huge proportion of Israel's Jewish community, especially at that time, were Mizrahi Jews from the Maghreb or Jewish people from other parts of the Middle East. He also attempted to link the war in the Levant to other post-colonial conflicts around the world, such as the Vietnam War that was winding down in late 1974, and various wars in Latin America. His speech provided a long summation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict too, going back to the First World War and the Sykes-Picot Agreement that had divided up extensive parts of the Ottoman Empire between the British and French. However people viewed it, and there were widely different views in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, Cairo and Amman, Riyadh and Beirut, there is no doubting that the UN Assembly address in 1974 was pivotal in Arafat's emergence as the global face of the Palestinian cause. Throughout this period, the Israeli secret services, Mossad, were trying to kill Arafat, and a special impetus had been lent to this by the events of the early autumn of 1972, when 11 Israelis from amongst their Olympic athletes and coaches were kidnapped and killed at the Summer Olympics in Munich, held in late August and early September that year. The Munich massacre was carried out by a breakaway group that had originally emerged from within Fatah. It remains unclear to this day whether or not Arafat knew what was going to happen or whether he sanctioned it. The likelihood is that he had some general awareness of the plan, but did not know the specifics and remained distant from it in order to avoid being held responsible for a terrorist act on European soil in years to come. Mossad and the Israeli government responded with extensive reprisals against key Palestinian targets. These included the Operation Spring of Youth raid into Lebanon on the night of the 9th of April 1973, during which several key PLO leaders were killed by Mossad operatives, and Arafat was nearly killed. There are understood to have been several other efforts by Mossad over the years to kill Arafat, including targeted bombings. It is also known that Mossad engaged in efforts to poison senior members of the PLO in Lebanon in the 1970s, though whether this extended to Arafat is debated. Inevitably, the details of these plots are shadowy, as they were not openly discussed, and material remains classified. What's beyond doubt is that the Israeli government and Mossad tried to kill Arafat on numerous occasions, especially while he was in Lebanon. After 1975, this was happening within the context of an open war in Lebanon. Israeli involvement in the Lebanese civil war was extensive, providing aid in particular to the Christian militia groups and armies that established a power base in southern Lebanon. The position of Fatah and the PLO was complex. At first, Arafat was reluctant to choose a clear side in a conflict that had numerous different sides and factions. On occasion, they were aligned, if not fully allied, with some of the Christian groups. Over time, the conflict was used by Arafat and the PLO as a smokescreen for attacks into northern Israel, something which was partially responsible for Israel's decision to intervene directly in the war in 1982. In particular, Arafat sanctioned the Coastal Road Massacre on the 11th of March 1978, when 38 Israelis were kidnapped and killed while traveling on a bus along the coastal road from Tel Aviv to the city of Haifa in the north. The operation was timed to disrupt the talks which were seeking to normalize relations between Egypt and Israel after the War of Yom Kippur of 1973 that had seen Israel lose control over some of the territory that had been gained in the Six-Day War of 1967. The Israeli incursion into Lebanon in 1982 in response to this PLO-led terrorist activity in northern Israel was decisive. It once again demonstrated the superiority of the Israeli Defense Forces, armed with Western armaments. Within months, after the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon and with Beirut under bombardment, Arafat decided that the PLO would have to leave Lebanon. Efforts to relocate to neighboring Syria were blocked by Hafez al-Assad, the Ba'athist dictator there, and so the PLO ended up relocating to Tunisia in large numbers in the mid-1980s, establishing Tunis as their headquarters. In the Maghreb in the 1980s and into the early 1990s, Arafat benefited from being broadly welcomed by numerous local dictators. Fatah and the PLO had outstayed their welcome in virtually every country that neighbored Israel. The Jordanian monarchy had feared it would be overthrown by the Palestinian majority in the country if Arafat and his Fedayeen fighters remained there, and had moved to expel them in 1970. Syria had eventually decided it could not allow the PLO to destabilize the country through its presence, while the entry of the PLO into the Lebanon demonstrated how destructive the presence of the armed wing of the Palestinian movement could be if present in a country. The same factors did not apply in the Maghreb, where dictators like Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya held absolute power. Even Bourguiba's overthrow on the grounds of ill health in 1987 and his replacement by Zine El Abidine Ben Ali as Tunisia's new dictator did not interrupt the welcome which Arafat and his followers enjoyed in the North African nation. Here, separated from the Levant, Arafat and the PLO presented themselves as the leaders of the Palestinian cause in exile. At home in the Levant, though, things were changing. As discontent at the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip since the Six-Day War in 1967 grew, new groups in these occupied territories emerged. On the 9th of December 1987, they launched what would become known as the First Intifada, or First Uprising, from the Jabalia refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. Over time, the Intifada became more violent, and was leading to serious disruptions to Israeli life, something which, for the first time in decades, led the Israeli government to consider the possibility that a negotiated solution to the Palestinian issue might be preferable to living in a constant state of hyper-vigilance and concern about attacks from within. The outbreak of the First Intifada provided Arafat with an opportunity. For over 20 years, Fatah and the PLO had been viewed as the preeminent enemies of the Israeli state, the groups that led militant resistance to Israeli occupation of all the lands that had formed part of mandatory Palestine under British rule. Now, however, a new generation of more radical militants, who had lived under Israeli rule in places like Gaza and the West Bank, were emerging and were seriously disrupting life in Israel itself. Before long, it became clear to political moderates in Jerusalem that it might be better to negotiate with Arafat and the PLO rather than face an escalating insurgency conflict within Israel itself. Aware of this, Arafat moved to soften his tone and present himself as a more moderate figure that the Israelis could work with. First, he limited the PLO's demands, though within a framework that made it clear that he still expected the creation of a Palestinian state. At a meeting in the city of Algiers in Algeria on the 15th of November 1988, he declared the independence of the State of Palestine, but limited his demands to this state consisting of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, including the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This was less than had been proposed under the terms of the UN-brokered deal of 1947, which was never implemented. Arafat was indicating that he was willing to accept less than had been on the table 40 years earlier. At the same time, he began to make statements which sought to repudiate his terrorist past and moved to present the PLO as the political wing of the Palestinian cause rather than an overtly militant movement. In this way, he positioned himself, Fatah and the PLO, as legitimate peace partners for the Israelis in the context of the First Intifada. The First Intifada would continue in the Levant for many years, only ending in September 1993. Throughout all of that time, Arafat remained in exile in North Africa, along with large parts of the leadership of Fatah and the PLO, although they were heavily involved too in events on the ground in places like Gaza and the West Bank. In April 1989, Arafat was elected as the head of the Central Council of what the PLO was terming the Palestine National Council. Effectively, this was the basis for a kind of experimental Palestinian civil government in exile, a move which, in association with the repudiation of terrorism and the tacit acknowledgement of the legitimacy of an Israeli state that would coexist with a Palestinian one, further signalled a shift towards seeking international legitimacy for the PLO as the government-in-waiting of a Palestinian state. Still, Arafat could often display signs of lacking political tact. This was the case in the second half of 1990, when he signalled his support for Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq, when he invaded and briefly annexed Kuwait. Admittedly, this was a complex issue for Arafat and the PLO. Hussein was a long-term supporter of the Palestinian cause, while Arafat also had to be conscious of the very large Palestinian diaspora community which had lived in Kuwait since the 1950s, following the First Arab-Israeli War. There is little doubting that his stance backfired when the United States and most Western nations formed a coalition to drive Saddam out of Kuwait and reassert its independence through the First Gulf War. This soured relations between Arafat and other Arab nations like Egypt that supported the Western intervention in Kuwait. Overall, it highlights Arafat's frequent lack of political guile, even as he tried to refashion himself into a legitimate international statesman. The early 1990s were dramatic in Arafat's personal life and movements. Firstly, he finally married. This occurred in 1990, after he had entered his early 60s. His wife was Suha Daoud Tawil, She was born in Jerusalem to Palestinian parents and had met Arafat in the Parisian offices of the PLO while he was visiting there. He asked her to join him in Tunisia, and they were married there in July 1990. The marriage was secretive. This was for multiple reasons. Firstly, Suha was born in 1963 and married Arafat on her 27th birthday. However, while the age difference was somewhat controversial, the graver issue for many members of Fatah and the PLO, as details of the marriage were revealed in the months that followed, was that Suha came from a Roman Catholic family and had been raised and educated as a Christian. This was problematic for many within the Palestinian movement, despite the fact Suha had nominally converted to Islam prior to the marriage. They would have one child, a daughter named Zahwa, born in 1995. Zahwa almost never came into the world. On the 7th of April 1992, while flying from Sudan to Tunisia with a stopover in Libya, Arafat's small plane went down in the Sahara Desert. Overnight, there were international news reports that the leader of the Palestinian cause was probably dead. But on the 8th of April, it was revealed that he had survived and had been found and rescued by Bedouin tribespeople in the desert. The crash was an accident attributable to bad weather in which the pilot lost visibility, and there is no suggestion that Mossad or the Israeli government was involved in this instance. Arafat had come close to dying in the crash in 1992. Several others on the plane did not survive. This occurred at a critical time in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There was considerable movement in the early 1990s towards finding a negotiated settlement, the biggest move towards a diplomatic solution since the United Nations had attempted to adjudicate on the division of mandatory Palestine into two countries all the way back in 1947 after it became evident that British rule was no longer feasible. After the collapse of the negotiations in 1948, war and division had basically characterized the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But now, the First Intifada had brought the Israelis to the negotiating table in the belief that a Palestinian state of some kind would have to be compromised on if there was ever to be security for ordinary Israelis in their daily lives. Otherwise, attacks on Israeli military checkpoints and other violent occurrences could become an almost daily feature of life in Israel. At the same time, while negotiations were now underway between the PLO and the Israeli government, it was evident that Arafat was not the man to lead the negotiations. He carried too much historical baggage and was lacking in diplomatic tact. Therefore, as the peace process got underway in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it was Mahmoud Abbas, the man who would later succeed Arafat as head of the PLO, who led the negotiations on behalf of the Palestinians. Negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis were tepid for many years. Between 1986 and 1992, the era in which the First Intifada started, Yitzhak Shamir was the Prime Minister of Israel for Likud. A staunch Zionist who had been involved as a young man with the Stern Gang, a terrorist entity in the British Mandate during the Second World War, he was reluctantly coerced into peace talks by the United States and the Soviet Union in a rare showing of Cold War unity by the two powers. It was really once Yitzhak Rabin and the Israeli Labour Party that he led won the 1992 elections in Israel, and he became Prime Minister, that the peace negotiations accelerated. Intense talks in Oslo, Norway in 1993 resulted in the Oslo Accord. This was memorably signed off in Washington, D.C., where a smiling Arafat was photographed shaking hands with a more somber Rabin, while US President Bill Clinton stood between the two men with his arms outstretched towards the pair, a photo which seemed to capture the benefits of the short-lived American peace that was descending on the world after the Cold War. 2 years later, the Oslo II Accord was signed in Egypt. Under the terms of the two agreements, it was concluded that a Palestinian state would eventually be created, one that would consist of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. This would be achieved over time, with an interim Palestinian Authority set up to govern the territories and gradually establish a legitimate administration. Arafat would be the first leader of the nation in waiting. The Oslo Accords seemed to augur success in his decades-long struggle for the creation of a Palestinian state. By the time the Oslo II Accord was signed in Egypt in 1995, Arafat had returned to the Levant. The PLO established their base of operations initially in the Gaza Strip, Arafat's father's birthplace, and a region which had been extensively connected with Egypt, the land of his birth, since the First Arab-Israeli War in 1948. Gaza had been held by Egypt until the Six-Day War, at which time the Israelis had taken it. It had also been retained by Israel at the end of the War of Yom Kippur in 1973. Gaza had been one of the core parts of Mandatory Palestine, which the United Nations had stipulated should form part of a Palestinian state as part of their division plans of 1947. Now Arafat ran his government from here, after returning to the Levant. Though later the PLO would remove their government to Ramallah on the West Bank, where it remains to this day. At the time he arrived there, the Nobel Foundation was determining who would be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for 1994. In the end, they decided on a tripartite division of the prize between Arafat, Rabin, and the Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres for their, quote, efforts to create peace in the Middle East, specifically for the Oslo Accords, which are intended to provide the basis for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. Rabin was assassinated for his efforts by a right-wing Israeli militant in 1995, while Peres went on to become Prime Minister as his successor. After 30 years of militant activity in Jordan, Lebanon, and elsewhere, the Oslo Accords had laid down the framework for the creation of a Palestinian state under the aegis of the two-state solution. It was now up to Arafat and his followers in Fatah and the PLO to abandon their militancy and prove that they could actually build the foundations of a future Palestinian state. These men had been soldiers. Could they now become politicians? They did not acclimatize well. Firstly, the PLO leadership was determined to centralize power in its hands in the new Palestinian state. This ignored a younger generation of leadership which had emerged in the West Bank and Gaza during the First Intifada, independent of the PLO and other groups that were broadly much older and in exile in North Africa. They also proved incapable of setting up effective instruments of government and relied on things like clan allegiances that went back hundreds of years to manage affairs rather than relying on technical expertise. Worst of all was the sheer corruption of the PLO after acquiring power in the embryonic Palestinian state. While reports of Arafat's sole daughter being a billionaire today are no more than conspiracy theories, the reality is that he and other senior members of the PLO did steal hundreds of millions of dollars worth of financing, which was otherwise meant to be invested in building up the Palestinian economy after the Oslo Accords. This horrendous corruption amongst the PLO leadership at the expense of ordinary Palestinians continues in the West Bank to this day and has robbed the PLO of its credibility. Finally, Arafat also failed in the years after the Oslo Accords by refusing to temper his demands. For instance, he refused an offer made in 2000 during negotiations at Camp David in the US, whereby the Israelis would largely withdraw from both Gaza and the West Bank, because he did not feel the Israelis were making enough concessions regarding Jerusalem. This was a very poor decision when viewed from the perspective of the Palestinian cause today. There were issues too on the Israeli side. It was not just the corruption, incompetence and intransigence of Arafat and the PLO that led to the gradual breakdown of the two-state solution. A major issue was a shift in Israel's politics from the late 1990s onwards. Because the Holocaust had been perpetrated in Europe by a fascist right-wing government, and also because Nazi Germany had been defeated in large part in Europe by the Soviet Union, there was a general tendency for left-wing political parties to dominate Israel's politics during the first 3 decades of the history of the Israeli state. That began to change in 1977, when the recently formed Likud party won elections that year, and Menachem Begin, a former head of Irgun and the individual who had sanctioned the bombing of the British mandatory government in the King David Hotel back in 1946, became Prime Minister of Israel. He and his successors in Likud had lost popularity because of the invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and other actions, and the left eventually came back to power in 1992, allowing for the peace process to be furthered by Rabin and Peres in the early 1990s. However, a reaction occurred in 1996 following the establishment of the two-state solution. Likud came back to power, and Benjamin Netanyahu became Prime Minister of Israel for the first time. Thereafter, power in Israel oscillated between Likud and Labour every few years. The constant shift between left-wing governments that tried to further the peace process and right-wing ones that tried to destabilize it created a difficult situation which also undermined the two-state solution on the Israeli side. Hence, there were leadership issues on both the Israeli and Palestinian sides. Arafat was far from exclusively to blame. For 2 years between 1999 and 2001, Labour were back in power. Netanyahu's first term had ended after 3 years against a backdrop of corruption charges which have escalated incrementally in the quarter of a century since. The United States, in the post-Cold War world order, was also anxious to use its hegemonic status to try and bring about peace in the Middle East once and for all. Netanyahu was at odds with President Clinton. With Labour back in power, the Camp David summit was convened in the summer of 2000 to try to get the two-state solution and the peace process back on track. But, as we have seen, Arafat foolishly refused to make concessions when large ones were offered to him by the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. The failure of the negotiations was part of the cause of the outbreak of the Second Intifada in September 2000. This was led by much more militant groups this time around, like the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade and Hamas, and was much more violent than the First Intifada. For instance, while the First Intifada had involved throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails at Israeli army checkpoints, the Second Intifada saw widespread recourse to bombings, with upwards of 150 such incidents killing hundreds of people. Arafat's role in the Second Intifada was mixed. He was not in charge of it, but nor was he entirely uninvolved. In particular, after the return to power of Likud in 2001, he sought to harness the violence to try and regain the political initiative, though with broadly disastrous results in the long term. Arafat would never live to see the end of the Second Intifada. He was an aging man by then, having entered his 70s. Nevertheless, despite his advanced years, he was a relatively healthy man and had not suffered from any bouts of prolonged ill health, nor did he suffer from any serious conditions. Therefore, it was somewhat surprising when he became very sick from the 12th of October 2004 onwards, experiencing severe vomiting, nausea, cramps and diarrhea. Initial assumptions that he was suffering from a very bad bout of food poisoning or something of that kind proved incorrect, and his condition continued to deteriorate. By the end of October, He had been taken to France to avail of more advanced healthcare there. As his kidneys failed in the first days of November, he lapsed into a coma and he died on the 11th of November 2004 in the HIA-Percy Hospital in the suburbs of Paris at 75 years of age. Even before he died, there was unrest about his illness. His wife Suha had been reluctant about sharing too much information with the Palestinian National Authority about his condition, and this has further fueled speculation that he may have been poisoned. Various other theories even included a suggestion that he had died from AIDS, a fairly improbable conclusion. It remains possible that Arafat was poisoned, but the most likely explanation, based on several doctors' accounts from the time, is that he suffered from some sort of severe infection which led to a combination of liver and kidney failure, though we will probably never know for sure. Within hours of his death, preparations were being made to fly Arafat's remains back to the Levant. His body was briefly displayed in Cairo, and then flown onwards to Ramallah on the West Bank, where the main funeral was held amidst large crowds on the evening of the 12th of November. He was buried in Ramallah after requests for a burial in East Jerusalem were refused by the Israeli government over concerns this could become a flashpoint between Jews and Muslims in the Holy City. Arafat's death, whatever the circumstances of it, provided a window in which to de-escalate tensions in the Levant and bring the Second Intifada to an end. It helped that his successor, Mahmoud Abbas, was viewed as a more moderate Palestinian leader, both in Western capitals and within certain circles in Israel. Within weeks, a political summit was being organized in Egypt, and at Sharm el-Sheikh in February 2005, agreements were put in place to bring the Intifada to an end and try to get the peace process back on track. The Israelis accelerated a process begun in 2003 and 2004, whereby they dismantled their settlements in the Gaza Strip and completely disengaged from that region, while Abbas and the PLO began organizing fresh elections for the Palestinian territories. However, the result when the elections were held in January 2006 was a political earthquake. Abbas, Fatah and the PLO were defeated by Hamas, a more militant group that had emerged back in 1987 at the start of the First Intifada, and which had grown in popularity as a sense developed that the PLO and Old Guard were both corrupt and incapable of delivering on the promises Arafat had made over so many years. Because Hamas's base of support was strongest in the Gaza Strip, it ended up taking over there, while Abbas and the PLO came to rule the West Bank, effectively creating a split within the Palestinian state before it had ever truly been realized. This division was actively encouraged by Benjamin Netanyahu, the figure who has dominated Israeli politics since his second term as Prime Minister began in 2009, as a divided Gaza and West Bank led to the two-state solution being almost permanently shelved. The Israeli-Hamas war, which began in October 2023, means that a resolution to the Arab-Palestinian conflict seems in many ways as far away as when Arafat first went to fight for the Palestinian cause back in 1948. For nearly half a century, Yasser Arafat was the public face of the Palestinian cause. The curious thing about this is that he was not a complete Palestinian by birth. He was born in Cairo, in Egypt, in 1929, and while both of his parents had substantial Palestinian heritage, he also had some Egyptian blood. Moreover, he grew up in Egypt and was educated there. Yet his Palestinian ancestry meant that he could not ignore the developing political situation next door to Egypt, in mandatory Palestine under British rule. When the efforts of the United Nations to mediate the creation of both an Israeli and Palestinian state out of the mandate in the aftermath of the Second World War failed, and Israel moved to establish itself as an independent nation, Arafat went to fight around Gaza in the First Arab-Israeli War. He spent much of the 1950s back in Egypt, influenced by the drift of politics there, including the end of British rule through the Egyptian Revolution and the Suez Crisis, the latter of which proved that neither the Western powers or Israel were infallible. In Kuwait, by the end of the 1950s, he became involved in the Palestinian exile community and played a prominent part in the foundation of both Fatah and the PLO. By the end of the 1960s, he had become the chairman of the PLO and the de facto leader of the militant movement to establish a Palestinian state. A quarter of a century of movement and war followed, first to Jordan, then to Lebanon, and finally to Tunisia and the wider Maghreb in the 1980s. The outbreak of the First Intifada in 1987 provided the opportunity for Arafat to press the case for the PLO being a legitimate power that the Israelis could work with to bring about an end to the violence in the Levant. And so, the Oslo Accords came about in the mid-1990s, and the two-state solution was reborn. Arafat had seemingly triumphed 3.5 decades after first founding Fatah, and despite many Israelis continuing to essentially view him as a terrorist. But the honeymoon period was short-lived. A political backlash followed within Israel itself and allowed for the first emergence of figures like Benjamin Netanyahu, while Arafat and the PLO proved incapable of delivering on what they needed to accomplish to further the peace process. When Arafat died in 2004, peace between Israelis and Palestinians was more distant than it had been a decade earlier, when the Oslo Accords were first agreed. Today, peace seems utterly improbable. What do you think of Yasser Arafat? Was he a terrorist who orchestrated inexcusable acts of violence against civilians and military targets alike? Or was he a legitimate defender of the Palestinian cause who engaged in violence only with the aim of bringing about a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.